No. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable, especially after the bank holiday. Hope to say that everyone's had a nice time. And it's nice to see so many people coming in on the Tuesday, because I know sometimes it can be a bit of a challenge straight after the bank holiday. So good to see some faces in the room. My name is Matthew Baird. To anyone who I haven't worked with, spoken with, or anything like that before, I've been doing social housing recruitment for the last 11 and a bit years. And then when I set up on my own just over 2 years ago, I founded the Social Housing Roundtable, which is a free weekly discussion group for anybody and everybody associated or working with or affiliated with social housing, with the aim to really try and kind of have open, free discussions around the nature of the system at the moment, what's going well, what maybe isn't going well, and what we can all do to hopefully try and improve it. Through that, the roundtable is always free because of the recruitment work. So I always kind of say that the more people that use me for recruitment, the longer they can stay free. So that's just the little plug on that side. But without further ado, I want to introduce Rebekah today, who I'm going to get to do kind of her own introduction. We've got a presentation that we're going to be going through, but I think we reached out via LinkedIn and previous roundtable work, really. And we've done so many of these roundtables now. I think the YouTube channel's got about 65, 66 videos or something, but very rarely do we specifically focus on older people's services. And when Rebekah and I got speaking, particularly around the changing services that are coming through and the increased demand we're going to be seeing over the next number of years, it was absolutely imperative to A, have one on here, but B, really kind of showcase what SCIE and Rebekah are doing to try and kind of create a toolkit for the future of older people's services and what they might look like. So without further ado, I will pass across to Rebekah. Thank you so much for being here today. And I'll leave it in your capable hands. If anybody has questions at all during the presentation, please put them in the chat. After that, there will be an open discussion and I'll be asking for raised hands and things. But for now, Rebekah, all yours.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for the introduction. I've just shared my screen. Can you just give me a thumbs up? That's all good. Brilliant. Thank you. So I'm Dr. Rebekah Luff, and I'm Senior Research Analyst at the Social Care Institute for Excellence, or SCIE. It's great to be here, and thanks for the invitation to speak to you all today. So my background is far more around research on social care, particularly for older adults. And so that's the direction that I became interested in, housing for older adults. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a bit about the commission that SCIE led and I project managed, and that was in relation to housing for older adults, and then the ongoing work that I'm now doing from that commission, specifically around supporting local areas to develop place-based plans for housing for older adults. So these plans, they're not specific to social housing, but social housing is, of course, a key aspect of any local plan. And so while I'm taking a slightly wider picture, it would be really interesting and helpful to hear some of your own thoughts and insights regarding the role of social housing in these kind of local plans. So back in the autumn of 2020, SCIE were funded by the Dunhill Medical Trust to run a commission that looked at the role of housing in the future of care and support. And the commission responded to one key question. So how do we ensure that older people have a range of housing to meet their needs at the time that they need it? So our focus for the commission was on housing out with of general housing. So care homes, housing with care, housing with support, shared lives, and some forms of community-led housing, such as co-housing. And you can see some of the key aims of the commission on the slide, but including developing a roadmap to support the implementation of our vision. So we didn't just want a list of recommendations, we wanted a more detailed plan. How do we get from where we are now to where it is that we're trying to go? And on the right of the slide, you can see the front page of our report. So the commission itself was a substantial piece of research and also policy work. So you can see the research and evidence activities on the right of this slide and the governance on the left. So it was co-chaired by the Right Honourable Paul Burstow, Professor Julienne Mayer, and also Sir David Pearson. And you may be aware that Julienne Mayer has recently been announced as the chair of the government's Older People's Housing Task Force. So really, really helpful links there. And there was also a commission panel that was 14 leaders from across social care, housing, and the commission was then further guided by a co-production collective. So that was people with lived experience and also a stakeholder reference group. And that was a larger group than the commission panel, and that was from across government departments, academia, local authorities, charities. And we published our report, which was called A Place We Can Call Home, in November 2021. And that's an evidence-based vision and also a roadmap, as I mentioned, for providing more options for housing with care and support for older adults. So we really focused on where are we now, where do we want to be in about 10 years' time, and how might we be able to get there. And you can see the full report, roadmap, our survey, and examples of promising practice and more on our website. And I've got the link to that at the end of the slides. So here's our roadmap for change. It's okay, I'm well aware that there's too much on there for you to clearly see, but what I wanted to do was just highlight that we set out immediate, medium, and longer term priorities. And we did this at both national and local levels. And those things all link together and then feed across over time. But what I want to do is focus on just one of these. So kind of zooming in here. And that's an immediate priority that was for local areas to develop place-based plans for housing for older adults. And these plans are pivotal so that local areas can better understand local needs, both now and in the future, and they can work towards meeting those needs. Providers will be able to see what the plan is and how they fit into it, and that can then include new opportunities for them as well. We found that currently many areas are quite reactive rather than proactive in relation to their planning and what they were going to do going forward. But as you can see from this quote here, which is directly from the Commission report, the plan should be shaped in partnership with the local authority, the NHS, local housing providers, and that would include social housing, local planning authorities, social care, and people who draw on care and support. So the Commission additionally set out what the steps for developing a local business case or a local plan for housing for care and support might be. And those are the steps there that we set out in the Commission. And at SCIE, we've now started working on developing a toolkit to help local areas with developing their plans and to provide some examples from local authorities that already have one and that have already done some of these different steps. So the final version will almost certainly look a little different to this. So for example, we're planning to remove co-production as a single element and have it running through all of the steps instead. But what my aim for this toolkit is for it to be very straightforward and engaging so that anyone, local housing providers, charities, older people, can understand it and can understand how they might fit into it and be able to contribute, rather than this only being seen as something for commissioners. So those are some of the different steps there, and some of them are obviously a little bit more straightforward than others, but it's also clear that before one starts planning, it's understanding where you currently are, understanding what you're going to need in the future. However, in the Commission, it was also clear that local housing partnerships that I referred to in the previous slide that are needed to develop and to drive forward these plans, they can be really hard to form and they can be really hard to sustain. So in relation to this toolkit, there's almost a step zero that we need to look at. How do you bring the people together to take responsibility for and drive forward both the planning and then implementing those plans? And so we're working with Stirling University and the Housing Link to pilot a novel way to bring together such partnerships and to reduce silo working. And that is called a serious game. So to tell you a bit more about the pilot, it's funded by the Dunhill Medical Trust. And a serious game, it's a way to facilitate positive impact to help organisations to future-proof their plans for an ageing population. And I take absolutely none of the credit for developing this plan. It's designed by Socio Ludo at the University of Stirling, and they're led by Dr. Vicky McCall and Professor Alistair Rutherford, who are absolutely central to this pilot study. And you can see the picture at the top there. It's an actual game. It's a large board game. We're planning to play it with about 25 people. People get very involved in playing the game as well. It's a fun way to address the issues. But let me explain a little bit more. So serious gaming is a tool that helps and supports with developing these local partnerships by helping to engage the local stakeholders and bring people together to overcome challenges. So it's essentially about facilitating communication, so supporting negotiation and interaction between these different stakeholders and groups who may not be used to working together. And this helps to make complex issues such as housing much more accessible and support strategic thinking. But to make it work, you have to get the right people in the room. And I think that is the most challenging part of the pilot work that we're doing at the moment, is identifying and inviting and getting people engaged. So we need those people in the room so that they can have those key conversations and so that they can narrow down their priorities and focus on those. And those key people should, of course, include social housing, and certainly will do in our pilot. So our first pilot study of serious game is being undertaken in Southwark in October, where we're working with United St Saviour's charity, which provides almshouses in Southwark. And we've also been really fortunate to liaise with HACT and their ageing friendly social housing programme. One of their networks is in fact going to be in Southwark. And this was just happy coincidence. Neither of us knew that the other were working in Southwark at the same time. So in the game, what we'll do is we'll bring together people with different perspectives, and then each player joins a team that represents a stakeholder group, but it's not a group that's the one that they belong to in their day job. So a service provider might take on the role of a policymaker. A commissioner might take on the role of an older person. And that allows people to see different perspectives and also to step back from their day job. So all of the minutiae and barriers that we see in terms of what we can't do, stepping away from those. And so then the different actions taken by each group play out over time in a fictional place, currently called Hopetown. And the people can see the impact of those decisions on the communities that live there. So it's a safe and a collaborative environment, as well as being quite good fun. There's usually one or two people that have to be, taken away from the game table towards the end of the day because they get so involved in it. And then following the game, a wider group is invited to join a workshop, and there's some reflections and findings from the game, as well as a prioritisation of next steps. So we very much come away with and what's going to happen next as a result of bringing you all together. So that is a bit of a whirlwind overview of the commission, the toolkit, and then the serious games, and that those things are all woven together. And thank you very much. As I say, here's the link to the commission, and I can also pop some more links in the chat to different things if you'd like. So very happy to take any questions, and then, as I said, hear your thoughts on local plans in general and the role of social housing. So let me stop the sharing.
Thank you, Rebecca, and I'll make sure that gets shared round. And I think it's really interesting to see so many different facets that are coming together to try and really ensure. I think quite often what a serious criticism of housing is that people don't listen to people at every single level, and yet that's clearly being an integral part of how the decision process is being made. And was that something kind of led from a SCIE perspective, or that just something that was always there from the beginning?
I mean, SCIE certainly believes in partnership working, and our ethos is one of co-production, so co-producing policy and practice with people that use services. So that's already something that we do, but it was very clear in undertaking the commission that older adults aren't being included in decision making, and neither are carers and people that have experience of trying to navigate this very confusing system, but they are more than capable and willing to do so. So, you know, we had really great suggestions and coming from people that draw on services, but we just think that should be a part of what happens in everyday use. Not saying that that's easy, and it does take more time and it takes a certain set of skills, but it is so important, and that's part of the game as well. If people don't include the older adult group, then they're not going to end up with services that meet the needs of people. But again, the partnership working in terms of different stakeholders and services, it's such a busy field, isn't it? Even if you just looked at social care providers for older adults, there's a huge amount there, and then link that in with the housing. So how do we work together in a way that the right people are around the table? And
how is this a toolkit then that's already, I know it's still relatively new, so has it gone out to every provider already? Is it still in the process of being finalized? Where is it in terms of its journey at the moment? We've
just started working on it, so we have a top level outline of what we think the key aspects are from the commission, but we've only just started our kind of research and evidence gathering on that, and then we're going to have an advisory group and move forward to doing some group work and interviews with people that are going to be able to help us develop that. So that's due for publication March next year.
I mean, I love the fact, by the way, and I'm going to bring people in now, but I love the fact that you've made it into a game. I think it's a different way for people to actually engage with it. I think so often people can just read something and be like, oh, that's fine. But when you actually play something like a game, or you are involved in really understanding how it all falls together, I know you're calling it a serious game, and rightfully so, because you don't want it to be sound as if it's being flippant in any way, but actually putting something together to see how it works is imperative. There's a question there from Anthony Bradley in the chat. How do you think the sell-off of council housing has impacted social housing? I'm assuming there's a lot of this under the right to buy and the general selling off of stock. Do you feel that that's having an impact on older people's services based on some of the research you've undertaken so far?
So I wouldn't call myself an expert in this area, just to be clear, and in terms of council housing. And also we did end up focusing the commission on housing with care and support. But what I do know is that there used to be more housing with support. So what used to be maybe warden assisted type of housing, and more of that used to sit in social housing than it does now. And that is absolutely an issue. But I think in terms of people being in general housing, that's of good quality and safe and meets their needs, there are clear issues around that. And some of that links to a reduction in council housing provision. And that means it's more likely that people are going to need to draw on other social care and specialist housing for people who need care and support, because they're not able to remain in place in their own home if it's not safe and suitable.
Completely understandable. And I know when I first started in recruitment, I say 11 years ago, if someone was hiring a scheme manager or a warden, it would be for one site, and now it's always for at least three, like one person covering three. There's been a dramatic shift there. David, I'm going to bring you in. Thank you so much for coming today. We've got David, Honey, and then I'll go to Nigel. But David, over to you.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Rebecca. It's really interesting. Sorry, there's a dog. My neighbour's got a dog, and it's really annoying. So hopefully everyone can put up with the barking.
We can't hear it. We're okay.
I can, and it's doing my head in. Listen, Rebecca, one of the things that really interests me, I've got involved recently. I'm a consultant in the sector around technology, but one of the things I've got involved in recently has been with a tech startup that looks at fall management and healthy living and wearable devices and so on. I don't know if the wider group, Rebecca, you and others might know this, but the government has stated some grand plans that by, I think it's 2035 or 2030, for the average age to be added 5 years to the average person, and that's done through healthy, independent living. Rebecca, in your research, do you take account of technology and how that can potentially help?
Yes, so there was a part of the commission that focused around technology and working with Housing Lane and others. They certainly bring in that focus, and we are working on some other projects at SCIE as well, which are focused on the use of technology. I think with two areas, both in terms of technology can support people to live in general housing, but it can also really help to facilitate the experience in any kind of housing, and in fact, you know, should be available all across. And part of that conversations and co-production with people that draw on services is looking at, well, what would be ideal to them, what would they like in their own home, what would they like to see services providing. Obviously, as we're all using more technology in our home, some of this doesn't need to be specialized technology. It isn't technology for older people or for people who draw on care and support. It's just technology that any of us can use, and over time we're going to be more familiar with being able to use that to support us if we do have those needs. So it's a really fast developing area. I think it's ensuring that any forms of housing with care and support are able to keep up with technology, have made space to be able to make adjustments going forward. I mean, we found even from COVID that a number of social care providers that didn't really have adequate Wi-Fi, for example, which is kind of a must-have now. So yeah, it's a really, really important interlinked area, definitely.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And like I say, I mean, that technology piece, I think, is just going to tie into everything more and more. I know that Alertical are sponsoring the roundtable we're doing live at Housing 2023, and you know, one of their things, exactly what Rebecca said there, is yes, okay, it's originally designed for kind of to replace almost the old style pull cords and that kind of stuff, but actually you can use this anywhere, you know, if there's a care and support need. And I think it's that distinction between the two that hopefully those barriers will be broken down. Honey, lovely to have you with us. Do please come in. Thank you, Rebecca. That was really interesting. As Matt said, I'm Hani Premlal, and I'm the chair of House Association. We specialize in sheltered and extra care housing, and obviously we are we have developed a scheme last year, and we are in the pipeline of thinking of developing another one. So this model is really interesting to me. So how we can apply this learning and put into where we are hoping to develop as well. How did you involve the customers? Because I'm thinking of obviously the customers, I mean the future customers, because you're thinking about, you know, when I started my housing career, probably 26 years ago, 55 is that we consider as a retirement age or older person, that thinking. Now, you know, if somebody is saying just even 65-year-old, you know, they think, how do you see that change then shift? Because people are living longer. How do you know, in 10 years time, 15 years time, what should be the sheltered housing should look like? How should be prepared for the future? How can we help?
So I think there was a kind of first question about how did we include customers in the commission. So a number of different strategies. Just to flag up, we were doing this very much during the COVID time and lockdown, so face-to-face 100% not an option, and we undertook a population survey with YouGov, and it was all adults, but we managed to get a larger sample of people who were aged over 55 and over 75, and we asked them about 5 different forms of housing with care and support, whether they'd heard of them before, what they knew about them, and then what they thought might be some of the benefits and some of the concerns or challenges around living there, and then just asked for some general thoughts. And we had a really good response. People wrote a lot, they were really engaged, they were very clearly able to once we explained the difference between each of the 5 types, clearly able to distinguish between them. So there is a way to engage the public on a very kind of top level consultation way. Also very aware that people thinking about if they have needs in the future is different to making that decision when that's what's happening at the moment. So being aware of how we understand those surveys. And then we did lots of conversations, mainly online, with people that draw on services and people that support them. And some of those lived in different types of housing with care and support, care homes, extra care, housing with support. And others had navigated the system, and they were in-depth conversations. But what we really did was we, of course, asked them about their experiences, and that included things that hadn't worked very well. But then we really wanted to understand, well, what things actually did work that you might want to see happen more often? What would have helped you? And how could we move towards that happening more often or happening across more of the country? So we used an approach that didn't just look at the negative, but helped shape a conversation around what could be, what would you wish you had known right at the beginning of your journey and all of that. So I think the way of approaching people and us having that conversation with them, and doing some of that in obviously a listening, but then a more positive, proactive way, we found really, really helpful. And people really had thought about it and had like designed villages and everything, you know, they knew more about it than I did, having been in it. So certainly that from the start. So in terms of sheltered housing and preparing for the future, I mean, some of that is, as we're trying to lay out in the toolkit, is doing some research around what your population is now and what provision there is now, and there might already be a gap between those two things, and then estimating what that's likely to be in the future. But you're right, there's generational changes as to the size and health and support needs of those groups, and also what the expectations will be. What's a home to people? So I think it's always a not having a, well, this is the answer and our job's done. There needs to be built in time to revisit plans and check, are we on the right track, and being able to do that, which I think at the moment doesn't get done as much. So I think I saw a report around, you know, there's a lot of older buildings of care homes at the moment, and it's not easy to retrofit them, for example, for you know, some provision and technology. Does that help? I think it is really trying to understand where we are now, where we're trying to get to, and explaining to people this is why we're making those decisions, but checking in. You can't do it constantly, but you can have that built into any planning.
Yeah, no, I did like the idea of, you know, getting everyone involved in one room and talking about it, because it's the future is going to be different, isn't it? Because I don't think the sheltered housing, the model we had, like Matt said, the traditional is no more in, you know, and then future could be even different. So we should be prepared for that, especially when we are building new homes. We need to be ready for that future. Yeah.
And there's, you know, aspects that we might want to keep, or there's others we want to change. And I think, as has already been mentioned, the staffing mix that you need of people that have a really good understanding of housing, but also of social care, maybe of different benefit provision, of the local healthcare system. That's a lot. That's a real skills mix that we need as well in our provision. So it's not just the bricks and mortar, it's also the wider system, and having people that understand what's available and what might best support an individual.
When you've got stuff like the exempt accommodation bill and things going through at the moment, obviously that's going to have an impact. And I think it's a really interesting, not in discussion, but I also, and I think it touched a little bit on what Honey said there, see whether or not that over 55 at some point suddenly changes to over 65. So suddenly it's because that age changes, because suddenly, you know, people who could be in service for 40 years, well, we can't accommodate that in the same way we could 10 years before. And it could be interesting. There's a couple of points in the chat I'm going to dive to in a moment. I'm just going to bring Nigel in because you've been very patient, Nigel. So let me bring you in and then I'll answer some of the questions in the chat. So over to you. You're still on mute at the moment, my friend.
Thanks, Matthew. Rebecca, good morning.
Hi there.
I really like that. Thank you very much. I commend you for this piece of research. And there's something new in here for me. Just when you think you know it all, this serious gaming, I'm going to look at it. It's something of interest to me. I guess I'm a customer then. I'm thinking of a label for me, and I think I've got it from Honey. I'm a customer. So no, I think this is interesting. There are two things that jump out to me here. It's a piece of research. It'll be interesting to see when it's applied, how things change and develop. But the two things that I think you've picked up already is this holistic approach, this joined up approach. Now, as you know, LAs and all kinds of social housing institutes and different bodies and all stakeholders have different agendas. They have different budgets. They have different things they want to do. So this holistic approach, whilst in theory sounds great and what we should all be doing, and being, I think this word now, buzzword, is co-production or working together in collaboration. How it actually applies in practice is going to be really interesting because everybody has disparate needs. It's a disparate body. People speak different languages, use different vocabulary, have different representations of the same thing. So it'll be interesting to see how this, and I will keep an eye on this, to how it rolls out and see if anything changes. The second thing you noted was the thing you've already observed of reactionary, but rather than proactive. And again, being proactive, like healthcare, it sounds great. It sounds like what we should be doing. But it goes back to budgets, agendas, and what is going on, KPIs and things like this in social housing. You may be aware of TSM, these tenant service measures, are going to be really impactful right at the front of customer engagement groups in social housing. So I commend you for it, but I think in reality, in practice, it will be interesting to see actually what happens. Thank you.
Yeah, I very much agree, and having the right people in the room and then playing the game with them is essential, and being able to reflect back to them some of the things that we found and helping them put together those first steps is part of what we're going to do. But we don't have control over what happens after that, and there could be a policy change or something else that changes, and then it's not people's priority anymore. We are aware of that, but then at the same time, firstly, one has to try, and secondly, some local areas might be in a better position to take this forward than others for various reasons. I think what we like about the game as well is that it's not a one size fits all. So we know every local area is different, the internal politics, the what has gone before, it's all different, but there's some similar themes in terms of that relationship building and the planning and moving things forward. And the game helps cut through with that. I think, in an ideal world, you can think of it as a ladder, and we want people to get to the top of the ladder. But honestly, if they can make a few rungs, that's really good progress as well. And I think we have to have those things as a win. We were hoping that we would be able to link this work in with what was the Housing Transformation Fund. But then that's not happening. So, even for us, the policy landscape changes. But the ideas are there, and the ideas are there in the Adult Social Care White Paper. So we're hoping some of those things might come around again. Where there might be a bit of a carrot that would help motivate local areas, because they might be able to draw down some funding to help them with this at a later point. But, unfortunately, we don't get, responsibility for those things. But it's a very good point. And in terms of being reactive rather than proactive, it's even in terms of being able to say, oh, we've got this particular gap, would someone like to bid for it, rather than providers coming and saying, we've identified a gap, and but maybe not knowing what underpins that. And also allowing for not every local area can provide every form of housing for every type of group of people, but being able to identify where the gaps are. Say if an area is doesn't have enough support for people living with dementia or people with vision loss, or something like that, they can link up with the other local areas to at least have a more of a regional plan around that, rather than everyone saying, well, we don't have enough of that kind of person for us to provide a specific service to them. And I know some of that does already happen, but this might be able to help facilitate that a little bit more. But you're absolutely right, and we're also aware that different local areas, they've got some kind of a housing plan, or they had something that was done 10 years ago and then it didn't happen, and then COVID happened. So we're trying to build some solid blocks in terms of the relationships, and then see what happens next.
Me, what I feel is really important with this actually is that at least it's facilitating listening. I think that's the key thing. It's that you're clearly kind of saying from the offset, right, people need to listen to each other. Let's make no assumptions, and let's properly discuss this. And I'm hoping that overcomes again some of those local differences that you described, because if people are listening, you design use the toolkit design services that work well for your local community. In terms of some of the questions in the chat that have come through, thank you to everybody who's been putting some stuff in there. A point from Mercer Denido: what were the challenges encountered when developing the toolkit, and what has been the impact of the toolkit from both the business perspective and from older people's perspective?
So we haven't developed the toolkit yet. There were many challenges on the commission, which I could touch on a few of. So at the moment, we're at the start of the journey in terms of developing the toolkit, and we're at the point of agreeing with stakeholders, and that includes the HSC, exactly what the purpose of it is, and so that we're all agreed going forward. And in terms of the impact of the toolkit, we're hoping to, as I said, publish next March, and then I will be looking for some kind of follow-on work or pilot work that we can do with a local area in order to be looking at impact or local areas. But sometimes the policy around funding for the evaluations is as exciting as the policy around the actual thing that you're looking at. But I hope that next year we're able to work with some local areas to start looking at the impact, and that maybe that could be more of a live document that we could then update, and certainly add more case studies and examples too. And we don't just want local areas where didn't everything go swimmingly. It's looking at the different sections and what worked well and what were more of the challenges. From a business perspective and from an older person's perspective, I think being motivated to be involved in that level of planning is something that we do see as a challenge, partly because people are just very busy, and secondly they might be cautious as to what kind of difference it will actually make. So there's always some work around that in terms of encouraging people to take part. And from the perspective of older people, these are quite long-term plans, and it's not necessarily going to make their personal lives better at that particular point in time as well. And also making any work that they do with a local area or with us as accessible as possible, which can also be more of a challenge. So partly these are very good questions that I will ask of myself in about a year's time, and let you know. And
I think that's the thing. But I think what's clear is all the time that the work SCIE is doing, this is always there in the background of going, right, well, what is the impact? Who's being impacted? Who else can be? And certainly from speaking with yourself and the team, that's been clear throughout. A point there from Michael Craggs: in the housing association world, we tend to build from the local plans or local demand, primarily new entrants only who are young, single and couples. There is little to no provision to build bungalows. I think we need to look at encouraging the release of underoccupied homes, move away from local demand and need, and consult with the resident and build the right homes in the right communities. And I'm guessing this is something actually that hopefully we'll see having some of the impact from the toolkit and the research you're undertaking will highlight exactly that, Rebekah.
I mean, in some way, that's a bit of it's a diversity issue, isn't it? If you're not including older people in your housing plans, then you've missed something out. And I can see why especially the political focus in a local area may end up being around younger people and families. But I think some of the work that ARCO, so they represent housing with care or extra care, some of the work that they have done has looked at, well, if you have housing provision for older adults, and that can also help circulation within the general housing, because at the moment people may want to move, they're struggling a bit where they are, and obviously there's a conversation about whether then houses need to be adapted and homes for life and all of that, but the accommodation might be too large for them. They lost their spouse or something like that, they would like to move, and there isn't anywhere for them to go, or nowhere for them to go locally, and so that is then a house that isn't able to, the property that's not able to go into the market. I mean, I totally hear you in terms of bungalows. We're doing our pilot at Southwark. I mean, that bungalows just aren't a thing, are they? So you know, thinking about what is realistically available locally as well. But I think that is why the conversation needs to be had on the whole, and certainly not pitching different generations against each other, but rather thinking of this as a system that needs to be healthy.
Michael, any thoughts on that, just before I jump back to David, but just in terms of, I know obviously you brought that in, I mean, in terms of your experience and side of that, based on Rebekah's point there?
I just think at this moment in time, we are only building to the local plan and the demand, which tends to be new entrants, which are singles or young couples. And we are not, and you know, the other bit is around grant funding. So, you know, we are not getting enough funding to build accommodation, all the person's accommodation. There is no encouragement from local authorities. I believe there's no encouragement. You know, we're all building 2-bed, 4 houses, you know, 4-person houses, and there's going to be so many of them in the market. But I know there's a huge demand. You know, I've been doing some work, certainly some research work around housing condition with NHS and health and housing connected with HACT. And, you know, we've got a huge amount of homes that are over-occupied as well and under-occupied. And we are just not planning on current. And I just wonder if there will be a shift in the coming couple of years around housing condition, health, over-occupancy, all that connecting, to make sure that we have, you know, suitable housing. And I agree, Rebekah, you know, we've got to start looking at some robust local plans that include lots of diverse community being allowed to live. We're tending to find that older people are migrating into towns now because the services are there for them. You know, carers are not going to work for £11 an hour now. You know, certainly in rural communities where we house a lot of older people, there is no services anymore. Buses are getting cut, bus routes are getting cut. So it's an emerging issue around, you know, certainly in rural areas. Older people are trying to migrate into towns, but there is just not the accommodation. And then the over 55 piece, dare I say that it tends to be a lot of over 55 just, and I fit in that category of over 55 men living in sheltered schemes now that have, you know, divorced. They're tending to go into those, and that's around housing demand. So you're getting a lot of mixed people going into, I believe, what should be suitable for older people accommodation. Not a good thing, not a bad thing, but that tends to be a reality now.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of complex issues. I mean, when you're talking, one of the things that I recall from the adult social care white paper is that you know, the government stated that every decision about care is a decision about housing. And that to me really clearly linked, you know, your health, your housing, your aging all together. But it's actually making those things stick at national and local policy. There's no one simple lever, is there, that's going to fix it? It is a matter of having the conversation and then, you know, maybe a step-by-step approach.
I do think it's that whole research of the You know, if you want to call it your stock, your makeup, you know, your occupancy, your demographics, you know, all of those need to be taken into consideration, and not just one isolated, you know, kind of a piece of work around older people. Because if we don't do it as community led, it is just not going to work. Because like I said, we have got some very large houses with some older people in who just cannot move on because there's not the right accommodation for them. You know, why would you want to move from a 3-bed house that you've lived in for 50 plus years with a nice garden, probably only single room living now, and big drain on the NHS, but there's nothing to live in that village apart from a 1-bed flat, which we think is a suitable alternative to shelter scheme accommodation. And I just don't think we're building the right homes for the right people now. You know, our needs and demands are changing.
And as you say, an over 55 now is, I mean, I know plenty of people, as I'm sure we all do in this room, that over 55 isn't like, oh goodness me, you need looking after and care. It's, you know, it's completely functioning as a normal person, but there's still that demand of going, well, have you looked at this because you're over 55 now? That tag as well needs to.
Well, we want a garage to park our Harley Davidsons in now, don't we? You know.
David, I'm going to bring you in. Thank you for being patient. Do come back in.
Yeah, thanks, Matt, and thanks for scaring me, Michael. I'm 54, so I'll soon be 55, and looks like I'll be in sheltered housing before you know it.
That's what's mad, isn't it? You realistically look at that and go, there's no need for support and care, but yet there is.
That's right.
That stigma going with it.
One of the questions is, I was about to type this up, then I realised it would have a long-winded question, so I'm better asking it to Rebecca, I think. I know research has been done in the past around what is the ideal model for elderly living, whether it's let's throw everyone into the one little community, or whether you disperse them into a wider community of mixed tenure. Has your research looked at that? Because I know in I think it was in Australia, and they did a retirement village thing in one of the landlords there, and it was not quite bungalows, but it was mixed about in more of a community as a small town rather than. And I can't see the government here going for that. But there's two things, Rebecca. Could you first of all put a link into the department or whatever you said early on in the call about the government's objectives? And I think there was a specific committee or something you mentioned about looking after elderly people. I'd be keen to see that, but also to get your thoughts on what does a community are you finding there's an ideal community for elderly people, or is it just depends on where you are? And you know, and Michael's point about moving away from villages into towns for the obvious reasons. Rebecca, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
What we found is that everybody wants something different. I'm sorry, I suppose I'm sitting on the fence, but it is a matter of having, so that's why we focused on having a range of options so that people can meet, you know, what their preferences are and balance that off with what their needs might be at that time. So when you ask on a survey, the vast majority of people say that what's important to them is to remain living in their own home, general housing, and what's important to them is choice,
friends and family,
independence. Yeah. But when you drill down, you do see that people say, well, you know, if I needed a high level of support, then everything that can be provided in a good care home, I can see what the benefits of that would be, as well as what some of the challenges or things I wouldn't like. I mean, even if you look at quite a specific group, so there's been some work with older LGBTQ adults, and there are now some housing groups which are just for older LGBTQ, like Tonic in London, and there's one in Manchester as well. About half of LGBTQ people say they would love that. They would love to go somewhere that was centered around LGBTQ people. And the other half say would absolutely hate it. Well, you know, what are you thinking? Yeah. And the same with some of this mixed or intergenerational living as well. So some people would really like that, but others see a real benefit of being in maybe more of a retirement village where, you know, not other people aren't at work either, and you might have more in common and you can go to groups together, you know, all of that kind of thing. So aspirational in a different way. So what we concluded was that you need a range of choice. But one of the biggest squeezes on choice is people's income, their equity, and often the group that had the least choice is the group that doesn't have social housing benefits available to them, or won't have their social care paid for by the council, they're just above that. So they've got just enough money to pay for themselves, but there aren't that many options within that budget range. Obviously, if you're at the top end, you get more options again.
Yeah.
So there's certainly issues around that, but yeah, there isn't an ideal. But what we did do in the commission, and I can't remember what they were called now, priorities of excellence, but we said that there are kind of 7 key facets that you should expect to see in wherever you live, whether it was a care home or whether it was in your own your own home and receiving, you know, in home care, that everybody should be entitled to a certain set of things. And I think that's quite helpful, saying almost a human rights approach, I guess, cutting across all types of housing, because at the moment it ends up quite siloed, and some housing options do have a stigma attached to them, which I don't think is very helpful if you then live in them. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question, but I think we should be threading what do most people want and need. But what feels like home to an individual is very unique. You know, I would want pets around more than I would necessarily want children around, for example. Everyone's different.
Yeah, just quickly, one of the things I work with a lot of landlords that are in very deprived areas, and there's elderly people you find that have been living in their rented house in that council or housing association for years, but what around them, the communities are getting younger and they're not getting that community feel, that support. Antisocial behaviours, increasing crimes, but you know, it's just something that I think is really important, that we look at people that are sitting in the middle of these things to where they would like to go. Anyway, I've taken enough time. Thanks, Rebecca.
No, David, I really appreciate your point. There was a question there from Deborah Blythe. How diverse were the participants, and were you able to cater to cultural needs when undertaking the toolkit, Rebecca?
So we hope to. In terms, as I say, we've not created the toolkit yet, but in terms of the commission, it was something that we struggled with. As I said, it was during lockdown, but engaging with older adults from different ethnic backgrounds, LGBTQ, older adults, people aging without children, so various different groups, which we were to some extent able to get in touch with and include, but not to a great enough extent as we would have liked. And so we would like to do some additional work that focuses on some of those groups, and I'm sure other people certainly know more than I do. I think key to note that any kind of geographical area where people are very much in a minority, they're just very much less likely to have the kind of provision that is going to support them. But there was a huge amount of variation. I think one of the kind of absolute privileges of working on the commission is that you get to talk to people about living in all of these different places. And so I was able to join a LGBTQ group meeting that was on Zoom, you know, because of COVID. Now there were these meetings, and that was a care home and extra care provider who had, you know, linked in their residents living all across the country to form this LGBTQ group, which was lovely and really helpful to link in with. It is a bit of a challenge though, and it's certainly something that we would like to do more of. But I think the thing with the toolkit, it's about supporting local areas with very practical advice as to how they can do that in their local area, appreciating that the makeup of different areas and the politics there is going to be different. So yes, we're co-producing the toolkit, but we're also explaining how local areas can do co-production themselves. We won't be doing it all, you know.
Yeah. No, I get that. One of the things you said, it was difficult. Why was it difficult? Yeah. What were your challenges to make sure that your group were diverse? Because it's great producing the toolkit, yeah, but if it doesn't cater to your population, then it's defunct. So what obstacles did you find to make sure that it was diverse, that it was inclusive, and so that you got the voice of the communities?
So in general, in co-production, where so SCIE's linked in with a number of co-production groups, often find that older people in general are underrepresented. There's much stronger representation from working age adults with disabilities, and also from carers. We also find there can be underrepresentation of adults with learning disabilities, for example. So in general, those groups that we had to call upon were already smaller, and then to ask specifically within that group, we would also like to be talking to these specific groups of people, was difficult. We did what we could. We were a bit hampered by COVID, because a lot of those things are better to do face-to-face in a community setting and be able to go out and meet people and link in with those different communities, and it was just harder to do. But it definitely is something that we need to do, more of and better going forward. I wish we'd had all the time in the world and all the resource, but we didn't. But what we did get was amazingly helpful and insightful, and luckily some other groups have done more work around specific group of people, being very aware that you can't just say BAME and expect that whole group to be cohesive and the same. So there was some work about different groups of people.
Really appreciate that. And where we've got about a minute left, and I think that's a whole a really interesting area to deep dive into, because it can be, I think there's at least an acknowledgement from yourself that there needs to be more done there, and I think that's a huge part of it, because so often, and I'm sure Deborah and others, and when I've been part of diversity panels and things before, so often it's, oh yeah, well, we've asked a few questions, we've got a bit of info, so we've got what we need, and instead you've kind of gone, no, we know we need more. We were hampered at the time, but when this gets to the next stage, that's going to be a deep dive for us, because we know we need it.
Yeah, we know there's some significant gaps, and that the questions and the gaps are going to change as the different generations age as well, because they're going to be having quite different experiences and expectations as well.
A couple of things in the chat, and then Honey had a question before we wrap up. So Anthony Bradley has said that back in 2004 he did a consultancy job for Glasgow to investigate the feasibility for an electronic social care record, bringing together social services, housing and health, and the police were absolutely necessary. And then Claire Patson, I can see data collection and data sharing being an issue when it comes to building out the toolkit. This is my regular reminder that data compliance can't be added in later, it must be considered at step 0. And I mean, Claire's phenomenal with data and has been for the whole time I've worked with her, but I think sometimes it can be very easy to look at that later on. Honey, with a quick last question from yourself before we wrap up today.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Rebecca, as well. It wasn't a question, probably an observation, because I'm managing different type of sheltered homes over the last few years. I've worked in an organization, older women's co-housing, absolute fantastic model. Women really take care of all the service delivery in that scheme, and fantastically run, and that's something I don't know whether we should do more of that, because empowering people to take control of their lives and do stuff more in their hands rather than do for them. I find people are much healthier and much active in those schemes where not pure sheltered. Just thinking.
Definitely, and I think having a way of sharing those examples of really good practice and where we feel things have worked really well, and being able to share those with other groups and providers is really important as well. We might not take a wholesale model, but people can pick out, well, what was the key learning, and what could we maybe do?
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you so much for bringing that to the table today. I know a couple of people are having to shoot because we've gone past that 12 o'clock. As ever, these just fly by. What's the best way for people to get in touch with you? I know it's at the end of the presentation there, but for anyone listening on podcast or anything like that.
Yeah, you can just get in touch with me at SCIE. It's on the last slide, or go to SCIE's website. It's info@scie.org.uk, and you can get hold of me that way as well.
Fantastic. And I know you've put a thing in the chat there, which I'll share around, which was the link for the government task force. So again, some really interesting reading. Thank you so much for joining today. I think it's really interesting. It's great to hear this is going on. And I'm really excited for kind of next year. And I'm hoping that this time next year we can do another one to, you know, see that 12 months have gone. Next week I've got Flores Nijonwe coming on with Pluto to discuss shared ownership. So completely different again. So a whole nother challenge and debate. So it should be a really interesting discussion. But for now, Rebekah and to the team at SCIE, phenomenal work so far. Can't wait to hear where the journey goes. And thank you for joining us today.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody. See you all again soon. Take care.